So welcome to my webinar on a theory of change demystified. Now there's been a lot written about a theory of change, and this webinar seeks to take a really simple approach to exploring how you can make your campaign happen by using a theory of change or a future story to drive your campaigning forward. And this webinar is the first of two, and we'll look at the theory behind this approach in this webinar. So firstly, who am I? My name is Jonathan Ellis. In terms of my background, I've been a director of campaigns for a national charity. I've been chief executive of a small national housing NGO. I've stood for the Westminster Parliament on 2 occasions, and I've been a trustee of 4 local homelessness projects, and I currently lead national campaigns. I'm a strategic advisor across a wide array of countries, and I'm a qualified teacher. And I love teaching campaigning skills around the world. So let's crack on. When I talk about campaigning, I often, in my training sessions, make this point that campaigning is not the same as running a project. I very often felt the need to say that, because campaigning is about seeking to influence people with power who have their own agendas in a fast-moving and dynamic environment. And it's so important for your campaigning to be effective that your planning is able to keep pace with this dynamic environment. So when you're thinking about campaigning, I'd argue that you need a theory of change, or increasingly I prefer to describe it as a future story for your campaign. And essentially, you're asking the question, what is the chain of events that will, in your opinion, lead to the change that you want to see on your issue? What is that future story that will bring about the change you want to see? Now I'm highly conscious that none of us can predict the future. I know that. But if you yourself can't see how change will happen, how do you think that change will actually happen in any case? And I've argued, and you'll see on my website, I make this point repeatedly, that I think for campaigning, you do need to have clarity on your problem and your solution backed up with evidence. But increasingly, I think you also need a robust and credible story of how change is going to happen on your issue. And for me, I think a synthesis of those two things are absolutely vital. Really clear message, but also a robust future story. And increasingly in campaigning, I think your story is so important. And I like to see the campaigning story in 3 parts. Where have you come from? Where are you now? And where are you going? And certainly when I think about reporting and talking about my campaign, I like that past, present, and future. Now, I made this point at a conference recently, and someone challenged me that they said, look, campaigners aren't storytellers. They're actually story makers. And I thought that was a superb challenge. And I think that person was absolutely right. This isn't about passively telling a story. This is about being an active participant in helping make a story happen. So before you develop your future story, I think it's really important to discuss the reality of your outside world, your external environment with your colleagues. Now, I find on my training around the world that people are really reluctant to do that. But I've found, to my cost, that you can't assume that you all have the same understanding. Before you start planning, just spend some time talking and sharing. Be explicit, challenge each other, and then write down that shared common understanding of your outside world. Now, unless you do this, I think you run the risk of developing what I would call a fantasy campaign. And then as your campaign progresses, it's really important that you keep this external assessment under regular review to assess, to see, to judge how your views change on the reality of your outside world. And this then is the foundation stone upon which you can build your future story. So, what is a future story? I've used this very simple example around the world just to try and explain what I mean. And for me, a theory of change or a future story kind of revolves around 2 simple, small words in the English language, so and that. So we're going to do some research. So that. we can brief politicians, so that they can raise the issue, so that we can get some media coverage, so that the government responds, so that. That chain of events. You do one action so that you can do another, so that you can build momentum. I also think it can be helpful to distinguish between what I might call the big steps and the small steps in your theory of change. The big picture and the small picture. So going back to the example, the big steps behind that future story might be we're going to do some research so that we can build allies, so that we can promote our issue to government, so that they respond, so that we show how the change will help them, so that the policy is changed, so that. Those are big steps. And in between those big steps, there are many, many smaller steps. So the initial small steps, for example, on this example might be we're going to develop a terms of reference so that we can commission a researcher, so that we can plan a research plan, so that. But remember, and I love this quotation, and I'm not prone to quote German military theorists, but I think Helmut von Moltke is absolutely right here when he says no battle plan ever survives the first contact with the enemy. Now, I'm conscious that it won't be a battle necessarily, and that you may well not see your target, your campaign target, as your enemy, but I love the simplicity and the importance of this message. And it's so important that you review on a regular basis. Almost every time that you have external engagement, just think again, what have you learnt about your engagement that might change your thinking, that might change your future story? So important that you seek external sense checks. Does your future story make sense to people outside of your campaign with different perspectives? And so important that you challenge assumptions, to be open to be challenged, to be questioning, to be making sure that the logic in your future story is as robust as it can be. I also think it's important to think about what success looks like when you've achieved your campaign goal. Think about that ultimate goal. Think about getting there and achieving it. And then to kind of look backwards and say, well, from that point of success, how did you get there? And it can be really helpful to consider your theory of change or your future story backwards. From that point of achieving your goal, looking backwards as a way of complementing and adding value to your planning process. So that's a theory, the very simple theory behind my approach. But what does it look like in practice? How can you really make this very simple approach work to energize and to drive your campaigning forward? So do come back for my second webinar on how this approach can be used in practice. Thanks for your time.